Let's do this for the pure motivation of leading all limitless Mother and Father sentient beings to the ultimate. So today we're going to have a talk, and I don't know exactly what the talk should be called. It could be called How to Get Along with Others According to Dharma. It could be called How to Deal with Your Own Negative Arisings to Minimize Suffering of Yourself and Others. Really, if you learn to take responsibility for your own negative arisings and you deal with them, then you will get along with others better and you will have much less suffering. In the Buddhist teaching, negativities can be divided into various groups. One system is to consider them in 5 categories: anger and hatred, desire and greed, pride, envy, and ignorance. Ignorance is not seeing the world as it is, including buying into the illusion of self. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that a negativity is always a choice. People have these expressions: someone made me angry, someone blanked me off, and that has actually never happened in the history of the universe, and you can see it 2 ways. One is that if you're in a group of people and somebody does something and one person gets angry and other people don't, then it's very clear that that person made a choice, which is probably involuntary at this point due to conditioning, and the other people didn't choose that. You can also see it when you meditate and you slow the mind down and you have very good mindfulness and insight, and you will see the choice actually being made. The common thing is to focus outside, which is what people do in life in general. So people in general in life go through their life focused on what's outside them, their friends and their family and their possessions and their status and their all of those things, and don't focus much inside, whereas in Dharma the idea is to focus inside. But if you focus outside, then you're going to tend, when negative arisings happen, you're going to tend to want to blame them on somebody else, rather than take responsibility for it, when in fact it's always a choice. Now, these choices are partly learned as when we're very young children, and that learning is very much influenced by past lives. So, if somebody was a very negative, angry, fighting person in past lives, and then they're very young as a child in this life, they will probably learn to choose anger and hatred and aggression quickly, whereas someone who was a monk or a nun or something like that, or somebody really devoted to nonviolence, they might not learn it quickly, and they certainly won't respond to the same things. But basically, if you watch young children very carefully, you will see that when they're presented with a situation, they often don't know what to do. And then some reaction happens. And then if it feels good and they like it, it tends to become a habit, and eventually it becomes a habit so quick that they don't think they have any choice in it. That somebody does something and you instantly respond with a negativity of some sort. Now, negativities have, in the animal world, most of our negativities arise through the skandhas, which I'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes. And in the skandhas, the values are animal values, animal conditioning. And negativities have quite a bit of survival value in the animal world. So an animal that's cornered will then get angry and fight. I once saw a warthog cornered by a large cat, I think a leopard. And once it was thoroughly cornered, then instead of being in fear and so on, it turned and became angry, and it attacked the attacker, and the attacker had to run off. You know, and lots of animals will have that reaction when they're going to fight. Probably predators have negative emotions as they're about to make a kill and so on. Also, desire has the same sort of thing, you know, like the desire for food and reproduction. In the animal world, that helps with the survival of the individual and the survival of the species. And those desires can be just incredibly strong. You know, a male spider who knows he's going to get eaten in the act of mating will still go ahead and do it, you know. Must be some incredibly strong desire to do that. So when we move into the human realm, we still, due to the skandhas, have these same somewhat primitive emotions, and then we have to learn to put a nice face on them. If you want to see what desire is really like, watch a 3-year-old in a supermarket who spies candy and can't have it, and he goes into hell. He's in a state where nothing is any good, and he just wants, you know, and he hates his mother and everything like that. That's what desire is really like. All the other negativities, anger and hatred and pride and all those things are like that, but as we grow up, we're conditioned to put a nice face on, so that when hatred arises towards somebody, we convince ourselves that we're just a little bit annoyed, you know, and we don't really see it for what it really is. We put a nice face on it, and the same with desire and all of these things. We learn to mask what's really going on, both to ourselves and to others. And in meditation, you can have the experience of experiencing some of the negativities in their pure state, and seeing how absolutely horrible they are. They're based completely in selfishness, with no consideration of anybody else. Now, in the human realm, we have a lot more control over things. If a desire arises, it's a hot day and you want a cool drink, you're not necessarily completely ruled by that. You do have some choice whether to indulge that desire or not. And some things we don't seem to have choice on, like somebody does something and we get angry, we don't see that we had any choice. But in the human realm, the negativities, all of them have some other functions, one of which is to strengthen the ego. So one example is that at one point I was doing a lot of meditation, and I would be in a very great state of meditation, and then a daydream would arise in which I became in conflict with somebody, and we got all angry, and we hired imaginary lawyers to sue each other and so on. And it took me a while to figure out that what was happening was the sense of self was dissolving, and in order to get it back, the mind would generate these conflict fantasies or other fantasies to give you back that sense of self. So anger and hatred and some of the other ones strengthen the sense of ego. If you watch a small child who learns to say no for the first time, then for a few weeks they will say no to everything very strongly, because it gives them a big sense of self and self-importance and things like that. And we become addicted to that. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the translation by Trungpa Rinpoche, he has a commentary where he talks about that in great detail. And what he says is that humans in general, during the course of every day, start to, what he calls, move toward the luminosity. And what I would call having your sense of self dissolve and just being in what is, in reality. And when that happens, we become afraid. We don't like that. And so we generate one of the classes of negativity in order to bring ourselves back into a sense of self. And then we feel safe and secure. Whereas when the sense of self dissolves and it's just this infinite reality with no boundaries and so on, we become very afraid. It's very uncomfortable. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead proper, in the first 5 days of the second bardo, in each day, you see a vision of a Buddha who is the master of one of the 5 negativities. And from his heart is a bright light to your heart, and off to the side is a dull light. If you focus on the bright light, you move toward Buddhahood right then and there. But if you focus on the dull light, you escape that. You go off into one of the 5 negativities, and in doing so, you bring back the sense of self. So there's lots of different teachings on how negativities keep you from awakening. We would have the opportunity to awaken many times during every day, but every time it happens by habit and so on, and through fear, we retreat from it. And we do that mostly by creating one of the negativities. Is that understandable?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the other thing to understand, and we'll go into some of this more in a little while, is what's called the overview and the ego view. It's the same thing as the bright light and the dull light. The overview is anything that's not an ego view. The ego view is the what's in it for me type of view that we normally view every situation with. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. One time when I was very young, I was attracted to a certain woman, and she was with somebody else. And I was in a state of intense jealousy. And at one point, in the midst of the most misery I'd ever been in my life, I suddenly saw the world through her eyes. And through her eyes, being with this other guy was what she believed would bring her happiness and give her what she needed in life. And the moment I saw that, I wanted her to be with this other guy because I was seeing the world through her eyes. And what happened to me, so that's an example of an overview. What happened, and I got out of the ego view completely, and what happened to me then was that the negativity transformed instantly into bliss. And I just filled the whole room. Everybody in the room just became aware of this incredible bliss, and all the suffering of the negativity went away. That's what's called the overview. Do you understand that? Mm-hmm. Another example was also a long time ago. The woman that I was with and that I loved and wanted to stay with, I was not a monk at the time, of course, announced one day that she was leaving me to be with another guy. And normally one would react to that with hurt and jealousy and all of that stuff. And I was able to see the world through her eyes, and I could see that she really believed and she felt that this was her path to happiness, to be with that other guy. And so I instantly wanted that for her too. And I offered to pay for her to go there, and I didn't experience any suffering on that particular point. because I simply had not gone into the ego view, which would have brought me intense suffering. And it just didn't happen. Those are examples. That's another example of an overview. It's the same thing as the bright light and the dull light. In the book of Job, in the Christian tradition, Job is very disturbed by all the suffering in life. He loses all his possessions and his children and everything like that. They die and so on. And he starts criticizing God, because from the ego point of view, God's plan was terrible. And so he started criticizing God, and then one day God came to him, and God said, well, you're absolutely right. From the ego, from your point of view, you're absolutely right. He said, but consider, the antelope doesn't want to be eaten by the lion. But if the lion doesn't eat the antelope, then how does it live? And he went on to describe the interdependence of all things and the interconnectedness of all things and how everything depended on something else. And then Job got it. He got the overview, and all criticism of the Lord's plan disappeared. And so this isn't just a Buddhist teaching. It's just a practical teaching that works. One of the consequences of focusing on the outside and projecting your own negativities onto the outside is that then we get to blame others. And I'm not going to talk about blame very much, but I would suggest that you do an inquiry to figure out why it's necessary to blame. What is the function of blame? Why are we so eager to blame somebody else? When something happens immediately, it must be somebody's fault. Who is it? And what do we get out of that? And when you start to learn to live without blaming, life becomes very, very good. There's an old saying in Dharma, you can either be right or you can be happy. So if somebody does something that has negative consequences for everybody, you can blame them, and you're right, but you can't be happy. If you don't blame them, you can be happy. There's no way to be happy as long as you're projecting your negativities onto somebody else. It just isn't possible. Happiness arises when you abandon that. And one should really try to observe all these things in daily life. Now, what happens is that as we grow up, and again there's influence from previous lives, but let's just consider in this life, what happens as we grow up is that there is suffering. We suffer. Sometimes we can't get what we want. Sometimes somebody criticizes us, and we start to develop more complex patterns of negativity, such as negativity happens, and then we want to run away, or we want to quit, or we feel hurt, or we feel angry, or we turn off toward whoever that person is, or we can develop much more complex patterns. And all of those patterns, like if somebody does something and you feel hurt, that is still you choosing a negativity. It's just much harder to see. In the same situation, somebody does the same thing and another person doesn't feel hurt by it. And so those patterns need to be untangled because they're much more complex. It's not a simple thing where somebody looks at you wrong and you respond with anger, which is very, it's a one-step process. It's very simple. once you develop mindfulness, to see it. Also, I should mention that the Buddha talked in great detail about the negativities, and he said that it's easiest for beings to see the downside of hatred and anger. And it's much harder to see the downside of the other negativities. For example, if it's a hot day and there's an ice cream stand and you want an ice cream, and desire arises for it, you go and have it, and you eat it and so on, and you feel really good, or you have a cold drink or whatever it is you desire, it's very hard to see the downside in that. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's there. I'll talk about how to see it in a little later. Another reason that we develop complex patterns is for secondary gain. I'll give an example. Namgyal Rinpoche several times gave a teaching on the development of children, in which he said in families where the children don't get enough attention, each of the children will generally develop a strategy to get more attention. And he said the most common pattern is the oldest will be good. The second oldest will be bad. The third oldest will be sickly. And the fourth oldest will be crazy. And each of those is a strategy to get your share of attention, or more than your share of attention. And as we grow older, if you didn't get attention from your parents, you will still be seeking that. If you didn't get approval from your parents, you will still be seeking that, even after your parents are dead. And so these are examples of much more complex patterns that have to be untangled. But they're based in negativity. They're not wholesome, and they lead to suffering. And they can be untangled and abandoned. It's better to be the first one, the good. Okay, so one of the things that I said is that these are choices, and that you can see this in meditation. So I, twice in my life, had periods of meditation where I was meditating all day, every day, and the mind slowed down. Now, well, what happened was I went into a crystal clear state of consciousness with incredible mindfulness and incredible concentration and incredible relaxation. And in that state, the mind appears to slow down, so that stuff that happens that quick appears to take 5 minutes. And in that state, what would happen is I would experience a little swirl of energy in the unconscious, which would form into a bubble. The bubble would come up to the conscious and break open, and it would be a thought or an emotion or a reaction. And then the mind would consider what to do about it and make the choice. And so if this was something that normally made you angry, then you would see that there was a gap between the trigger and the actual choosing to be angry. And in that state, you could very easily just say, I don't choose that, and not go that way. So through intense mindfulness, coupled with a great relaxation and very good concentration in the sense of being with what's happening, you can see those choices made. And my experience is that if you decide once not to choose that, you completely have broken the habit, and you never make that choice again. So things that you were choosing to do without thinking you had any choice, then suddenly you had complete freedom. When the trigger arose, you could decide from any number of things what to do, if anything. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the effect of negativities on others and the environment. Most people think it's perfectly okay to get angry, perfectly okay to have desire, perfectly okay to have pride in your accomplishments and so on. There's even concepts like righteous anger and things like that, which are complete nonsense. What happens is that at all times we are completely connected with all other beings through interdependence, and we're generally not aware of it. We see ourselves as separate, and we're connected with the entire universe, but most particularly through our local environment. So, you know, I've read things like if somebody lights a candle in China, it affects people here or something like that. That's, you know, that's taking it quite far. But what you can observe is that if you're feeling a certain way and the sun comes out and the birds are singing and you go for a walk, it will tend to lift you up. And it's a two-way street, so that if you go for a walk and you're feeling really good in a positive wholesome state of mind, you will affect your environment and lift it up. You know, it will make the birds want to sing. It will make the trees want to blossom or whatever. It's a two-way street. Just as obviously the environment can have an effect on us positively or negatively. You know, similarly, like on a cloudy, overcast day, you know, if you're feeling a bit down, well, it will make you feel more down. And we all know this interaction, you know, how what's around us can affect us. But what we don't see is that we affect what's around us in the same way. And therefore, when you're in a state of anger or hatred, you are not just, it is not just inside you, it is poisoning the whole environment around you. Do you understand that clearly?
Yeah.
So that, and if there are others in the environment, it poisons them to some degree as well. And most of us have had the experience, at least once in our life, both ways, where we were in a room and people were sort of in a not great state of mind, and then somebody came in really happy and cheerful and got everybody laughing and lifted everyone up, and the mood completely changes. And we've also had the experience where people are in a pretty good state of mind and somebody comes in a foul mood and poisons the whole room, and then nobody's happy anymore. You know, most of us have experienced that. So in a sense, it's not really okay to be angry and all of these things and just let it be there. And then if we go ahead and express it to other people, then what we're doing is dumping our poison on them and sharing it with them, and harming them, and creating negative karma for ourselves. So the message is then that if we do have negative arisings, we should take responsibility for them and deal with them, and try not to inflict them on the rest of the universe and others any more than we have to. Now, in the beginning, we can't do that perfectly, you know, and we don't have to be perfect. But we should recognize that process, and then do everything we can to deal with things. You know, an extreme example of inflicting negativity on others would be, I read in the news the other day, there was an ex-boyfriend stalking and harassing his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend, and then eventually killing them, you know. And that's really letting it go wild and really harming everything else. But all our negativity arisings are the same as that, just maybe to a lesser degree. So really, we have negative arisings by habit, by having made choices in the past, whether we're aware of it or not, and these have negative effects on ourselves and others. If we don't deal with them, then sooner or later, when conditions are certain ways, these will flare up and possibly result in killing somebody or other horrific events. When we look at the newspapers, these things happen all the time, and in every case, when somebody gets angry and kills somebody, well, they have made choices in the past to make anger a habit, and then it's got to the point where they can't control it, and it flares up, and they do something horrible, and then they and others suffer an awful lot for that. I had an insight once that if one didn't totally deal with negativities, then it's inevitable that they will flare up in some life. And who needs that? Who wants that? So the question is, one needs to change those habits, and if not now, when? So, in my opinion, negativities are totally the responsibility of the person who generates them, and if possible, should not be inflicted on anyone else. So, if you decide to take responsibility for your negativities, then what? So I'm going to give a bunch of possibilities of things that can be done. The first is a technique where you something happens to you that you don't like, or you respond with some sort of negativity, and you can treat the situation as if it was created for you by your teacher or by the Buddha for your benefit. And then you meditate to see what that benefit is. And then you go on to a few more steps until you're in a state of love and gratitude. So I'll give a trivial example, so to speak. One time I was driving and somebody cut me off in a very dangerous way, and I got angry. And I happened to be coming up to a pullout where you could pull over and park. So I pulled over and parked, and I meditated that this incident was created for me, let's say by the Buddha. I think I actually used Namjo Rinpoche, but it was created for me by my teacher for my benefit. And that man who cut me off, he was only following the instructions of Namjo Rinpoche or the Buddha. So I sat and meditated, and how was this my benefit? Well, when I was a monk in Thailand, we used to have a saying that it's easy to be a saint in your kuti. And what that meant was that there was nothing ever happened to trigger anger or most of the other negativities, because you're just sitting alone in your kuti. You don't have to pay taxes, you don't have to work, you don't have to commute, you don't have to interact with others much, and so you just sit there. And it's very difficult to study your own negativities because they just don't arise. And it's not that you're beyond them, it's just there's nothing causing them to come up right now. And so the first thing I saw in this traffic thing was that this made me aware of my attachment to having traffic go my way, and then choosing to respond to anger when anyone else got in my way. And so I was able to look at that in great detail, and I hadn't been able to find that. I hadn't been able to access that when I was a monk in Thailand or other times in my life. So that was one benefit, that it showed me my attachment that I still had and my habit of responding with anger in those situations, and so I looked at that in great detail. And then I focused on the guy who did that. And what I realized was that whether he was an agent of my teacher or the Buddha or not, he was a human being like me who had some good qualities and some bad qualities. He wasn't perfect, and I must have cut other people off in traffic. I must have done what he did, and I didn't hate myself over that. And so I looked at that in great detail and accepted him as he was and loved him as he was, without him having to behave the way that I think he should behave. And then I went into a state of gratitude to him and the Buddha and my teachers for creating this whole situation. And after I was in a deep and true state of gratitude, then I generated loving kindness toward that man until I absolutely, totally, with all my heart, wished him the very best for now and for forever. And so what had been a negativity in the beginning was a total positivity in the end. That's transforming a negativity into a positivity. And then instead of poisoning my environment, I was probably benefiting it. The alternative, the worst alternative would have been if I chased him and forced him and then we had a fight or something like that. That's inflicting it on others, you know. And people do that, you know. So the technique is to meditate on what the benefit is for you, and then to somehow change it into a positive, to somehow get into a state of gratitude, and to somehow then get into a state of total loving kindness toward the other person. So I learned this technique in 1967, and I think it's the greatest secret in the whole world. It works really, really well. And after I had practiced it for many years, I could very often be in a state of hopeless negativity, and 3 or 4 minutes later be in a state of total love. The more you practice it, the first time you do it, it might take you hours to get anywhere, or you might not succeed at all. But once I had succeeded a whole bunch of times, then I could get from a real strong negativity that just has a stranglehold on me to a state of total love within just a few minutes by going through those steps. So it's a very powerful one. Okay, the next technique is the one that Mingyur Rinpoche teaches and recommends for his centers. So what he recommends for his centers is that if you're at one of his centers and you get angry at somebody or you get annoyed with them or whatever, you don't go over and tell them about it and then tell them why, you know, tell them all their faults and that you perceive and so on. You don't share it with anybody. What you do is you go to your room and you sit down and you say, right now I am feeling angry, or I am feeling hurt, or I am feeling disrespected, or I am feeling whatever. And then you say there must be many, many beings in the universe feeling that same thing right now. And then what you do is you visualize all those beings in the same state of mind, and you then say, I will try to help those beings. And what you do is you breathe in that negativity from all of them, and when that negativity reaches your heart, it's immediately transformed into love or some positive emotion or happiness, love or happiness, one of the two usually. And then as you breathe out, it goes back to all of those people and helps them start to overcome. And if you keep doing that for a while, then pretty soon you will be in a state of compassion for all beings, in a state of love, or a state of happiness, and your negativity will have disappeared completely. And you will not have inflicted it on anyone else. You will not have poisoned the environment other than the very minimum. And you will also, if you do that regularly, you will lessen your attachment to those negative states. Is that all clear?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you, and I say, I see there's people there that have the same feeling, and I'm going to try and help these people.
Yeah.
And so, what is the breath?
Okay, so let's say you're angry.
Yeah.
Okay? You say there must be countless beings in the universe that are angry, and you visualize countless beings angry. And then, as you breathe in all of the anger that they're feeling.
Okay.
And as soon as that anger touches, and you breathe it into your heart, and as soon as it touches your heart, it immediately changes to happiness or love, whichever one you've chosen. And then as you breathe out, it goes back to them. And as you do that over and over, all their anger goes away, and it's replaced with happiness or love or whatever. And without you even having to focus on your own anger, it will go away. And you will be in a state of happiness or love, whether you like it or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the third technique is to try to get an overview, to get out of the ego view. So one way to do that would be, say you have an interaction with somebody, and then you have a negative arising. Let's just say that it's anger, arbitrarily. So what you would do is you would go sit down, and you would try to give that other permission, that other being, permission to be who they are with their faults. And you would say, I'm a being who has some good qualities and some negative qualities, and every other being that I know has some good qualities and some negative qualities. I'm not down on my friends about their negative qualities. I accept them as they are. Why shouldn't I accept this person as they are? If I can't expect myself to be perfect, how can I expect anyone else to be perfect? And then try to see the world through their eyes. Try very, very hard to see what life looks like to them and what's important to them, until you come to the point where you see that they are longing for happiness, they are longing for liberation, they are longing to help other beings, and so on. And then all of your own negativities will be gone, if you can get into the overview. So that's a technique. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Now, another thing that, if you're having trouble doing that, you can sort of add on, is to say, the issue here is whether this happens or doesn't happen, or whatever, say they want to do it their way and you don't want it done that way, you want it done your way, and you get angry that they're not doing that. Well, and if you're having trouble getting to the overview, then what you can do is you can say, 20 years ago there was a similar situation, and I wanted it one way and somebody else wanted it another way. What the heck difference does it make? Like these things are completely trivial, and they pass. And whether it was done my way or somebody else's way, what is the point of it? Or supposing you're in a state of worry, and you can go back and remind yourself of times when you're in extreme state of worry, and somehow things happened, and now you're through it, and whatever, and realize that all of these issues, whatever they are that causes negative arisings, are ultimately incredibly trivial, and 20 years from now will not seem to have had any importance whatsoever. So why not see that now? And so if, I would just suggest that as an add-on, if you're having trouble getting the overview, seeing the world through the other person's eyes. And you can get creative and add on other things, like you can say, well, someday this person will be a Buddha and I will be a Buddha, and we could sit and talk about this, and they would say, well, I had these difficulties and these negativities and I worked through them this way. And you could say you had your negativities and so on, and you worked through them this way. and you could all have a big laugh, you know. You could visualize that and just realize that everybody has to work through their particular set of negativities, and why should you be down on somebody because they have them? You know, they have their package, you have your package, somebody else has their package, and ultimately we're all going to work through them. Or you could think of something else, you know, do whatever it takes to solve these things, and get into a positive state of mind. Now, talking about doing things my way, I remember many, many years ago, we were doing something, and I was really attached to having it done my way. And nobody else wanted to do it that way. And so I remember saying, okay, I'll just let go of it. And I let go of wanting to do it my way. And what it's like is it's like stepping into the unknown, you know? And so I watched and waited to see if the world was going to end, because they did it some other way. And the world didn't end, you know? So what's behind wanting to do it my way is that we have this fundamental illusion that if we control certain things in our life and in the environment and in others, then we're in control and we'll have less suffering. And it's a complete illusion. One has much less suffering if one lets go of control. So one should start to see this desire to control things and then ask yourself what's behind that. And then every once in a while just let go of that control and wait and watch to see if the world ends. It might feel like it's going to, but, you know, lo and behold. Okay, another worldly technique for dealing with negativities like anger. Go in your bedroom, get some pillows, visualize them as whoever you don't like, and beat the pillows until the energy of the anger dissipates. And it done right, it can work. But I would suggest that as a technique when nothing else works and you want to weaken the energy of it. You know, sometimes the energy of anger and hatred can be just incredibly strong, and that's a good way to weaken it. Or you could go beat the pillows and then do one of these other techniques, you know, when the energy of it's less strong. Okay, well, the next technique is to recognize the unreality of the perception that led to the arising. You like that one?
No, it was a hard one.
Okay, so we had a situation some time ago at the Hermitage where one person was severely criticizing others and over making the point that they're just telling the truth. And they weren't telling the truth at all, they were telling their perception. And the two are not the same. So one should realize that perception has nothing to do with reality. And that's a very strong statement. Perception has nothing to do with reality. In the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha says a bodhisattva should not pay any attention to what the eyes see, to what the nose smells, to what the ears hear, to what the body touches. These are completely unreliable. And so if you look into that, you could, for example, imagine a situation where, say there's a nice park and it's a sunny day, and a series of people, and it's a huge park, and a series of people go walking in there. So two young lovers who just fell in love walk in there. They might not notice very much of what's going on around them. They're very focused on each other. A fugitive being chased by the police He doesn't see any beauty anywhere. He only sees things in terms of where he might hide. A botanist would have a completely different focus than someone else. A dog going through there would focus a lot on the smells and wouldn't be very interested in the treetops and so on. And you could just imagine an endless set of beings. Somebody who's in a suicidal depression walks through there, they might only see the path in front of them. They might not look around at all. And you could come up with no end of people who could walk in that park on that same day and who would have completely different experiences of that park. And so the thing to realize about perception is that we get continuous data through the eyes and the ears and the nose and all that stuff, and we filter it through our hopes and fears and wants and conditionings and desires and things, and we don't, it's not objective at all. We choose what we want, and we color it, we change it. People talk about wishful thinking, but we'll very often perceive something that's going to go a certain way because we want it to go that way, and somebody else won't perceive that, but all perception is completely subjective and has little or nothing to do with reality. And we have limited senses. If you had if your eyes could focus on minute objects and you could see all the molecules that make up these things, then this would not appear to be solid. The table would not appear to be solid. It would appear to be similar to air with energy in it, if you could see ultraviolet and infrared perception, if you could see auras, if you could see inside people's minds, all of these things are things that some beings can do. If also, humans tend to focus more on what they see than the other senses. Dogs probably function more on what they smell than the other senses, What does an earthworm take in through his senses? It's probably mostly feel and maybe some smell, I don't know, So we don't even treat our own senses equally. We prefer, most species prefer one. There's an awful lot of animals that go more by smell than anything else, Some of them have very limited vision. I once read a book on bees, and bees have these very complex eyes, and they perceive polarized light, and they had some drawings of what a bee would see in the sky, and it's a bunch of little triangles with lines. Like, they don't see, if a bee was in here and looked at the lamp, he wouldn't see a lamp at all. He would just see all these strange polarized light patterns. And so his view, but he would take that as reality. The bee would take it as reality. The earthworm would take whatever it perceives as reality. The dog takes whatever it perceives as reality. And all of us take whatever we perceive as reality, even though we know every other being, their perception is inaccurate. And I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot of intelligence to say, if every other being's perception is inaccurate, well, maybe mine is too, and yet it's this perception that caused you to create the negativity in the first place. One really should study perception very, very much in detail. The other thing is that not all humans have the same mind exactly. I had a very bizarre experience once. I was seeing a female patient, and my particular view of the world at the time was sort of scientific, that things have a cause and effect, and it's either this or it's either that, and a bit mathematical. That was the way my mind was. And I was trying to explained to this woman what was going on with her and what the choices were, and she just wasn't getting it. And all of a sudden I tuned into her mind. And it was so different in terms of what was important to her. She mostly just saw energy patterns and so on, and all of the things that I thought were important in life, none of those entered into her mind at all. And she recognized that I was in her mind, so she told me what life was like for her, and I could see it. And she had a mind that if you were in a room and you saw something and she was in the room and saw the same thing, what she would see would be so totally different from what you would see that it would be astounding if you knew that. But we all tend to assume that everyone shares our vision of the world and to some degree shares our values and what's important and what isn't important. And that just isn't true. I remember one time when I was very young, I went to, I was with a friend of mine and we ran into these two other guys and we went to a movie, and the movie started and it was a little bit violent, and at one point the good guy was beating up the bad guy, and then he could have killed him, but he didn't. And these two so-called friends of ours, the two guys we had just met, they stood up and started screaming at him to kill this guy, you know, like finish him off. And their view of the world was just so completely different, you know, that if you're in a fight and you get the chance to kill the other person, go ahead and do it or whatever. I don't know. It was just some very, very bizarre view of the world. And so my friend and I left, and they weren't our friends anymore, apparently. But people just don't appreciate how completely different people see things. And if you work with, say, Native Canadians or Native Americans, they have a very, very different view of the world than, and they don't all have the same view as each other. You know, like each group sees things a little bit differently. So one should really learn to distrust perception and not base things so much on that. Another thing that one has to do is learn not to project things onto other beings. Most of us, if we see somebody do something, consciously or unconsciously, we will project a motivation onto them that would be our motivation if we were doing that. And it might not be their motivation at all. You might have already learned to stop doing that, but I know when I was younger I did that all the time. And people did it to me all the time. And I was always astounded when they did it, because what motivation they would attribute to me or what mental state they would attribute to me was just so completely not me, you know. It wasn't what was happening.
Well, that's judgment, right? Like you see something that's happening and you make a your comment, a judgment, you assess, and that's what you mean. This person is probably doing
an example would be you're at a discourse with Namjo Rinpoche, and somebody asks a question and he picks up his full cup of coffee and throws it at them. And you could project the motivation onto him, like, why did he do that, you know? And you would probably project the motivation that you would have done it, like he's angry at them or whatever, but that wouldn't be his motivation. His motivation would be something completely different, namely compassion. None of you ever project, though, do you? I don't know.
It's hard to say. I have a feeling that it's...
Well, it's a form of protection, because if you think you can if you can pin people down like that, oh, that's why they're doing it. And you can convince yourself that you're right, then you have that control again.
Yeah. Another example would be you cook a meal for somebody and they come over and they don't eat very much. And then you might project that they don't like your food or whatever. And that might be true, but it might just be that they're not feeling well that day or they're not hungry or whatever, you know. Joy very often cooks a wonderful lunch, and some days I'm just not very hungry. I don't know if you project any motivation on that, but I think you see that I'm, you know, not feeling well. So.
It's just really wonderful to be able to see if there is any kind of reaction.
Yeah.
That's the thrill, is seeing the reaction, like saying, oh, isn't that interesting? Like, one of the things that's happening to me is I'm getting to see here the difference between when I'm by myself and when there's people around. Like how, from my past, what I tend to do is, okay, well, I can make decisions here. I can control, or I can do this. And then I get to see, well, that's a propensity. That's something that somebody else comes with their opinion, and it's like, that will then, if it's not in accord with, like, anything really small, and I'll have an opinion about it. And that's just simply an opportunity to see where I have created something that's out of my own thing, which is totally not what I want to be doing.
Well, that's a good insight, because all of these things are really just in your mind.
But it's such a game. It's such an amazing game that look at this, what I'm doing. Like I
Yeah.
have this whole, a whole universe over here of my compost, right? This is my
Yeah.
universe. And everybody will have a different way of doing it. And it doesn't matter at all. You know, it doesn't really matter if the worms multiply and if the rats get in that one sense. But the opportunity is to see, you know, like a stance, like any stance at all, meaning right, me wanting to have it that way, or somebody else coming in and not doing, because obviously anybody else is going to do it completely different.
Yeah.
It just
Shame
goes
on
and
them.
Yeah, shame on them.
Can't they see that your way is the best way? What's the matter with them?
Oh, and even more, I think behind that is the feeling that this is really important. This is really important, and they're seizing onto something and getting very intense about it. And then all those other things come along and line up there, and everything becomes edged with intensity. And it's really hard to, you know, I think if you are living in a perfect world or in a cell in the monastery or something, how do you get involved and try to do something good without that feeling that this is important, which can lead to so much trouble? Because the minute you think it's important, you know, you start to drive it.
Yeah.
And you push it, and you know, it's...
Well, this is a really good example of today, because in a way, we both did our best in order to support this offering.
Yeah.
And yet, nobody showed up. But in the process, it was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea the consequences of my actions, but I know the feeling that I had when I was doing it, that this is something, like when you brought the flowers, I'm sure this is like the feeling of, this is something that we are offering. So whether people show up or not, actually, it's for me, it's the process of being able to be in this position of just having, well, not just the two of us, but just being able to walk out my door and have these amazing teachings, and to be able to somehow clumsily, whatever, manage to, you know, like it doesn't have to look like anything.
Yeah, just accepting how it evolves.
Yeah, and so in my mind, this is like an amazing opportunity. And I don't have an attachment to, you know, I would have loved a lot of people, and we did have conversations around the purpose of this, right? That the Sangha would benefit.
Yeah.
But it's just a wonder, like somehow it just just the two of us showed up, so it's
Yeah.
like, there's just no,
Well, there's a beautiful simplicity to just accepting whatever happens.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to exist in this world in a busy way and stay on track with that. Because
Yeah.
there's such a push everywhere to assign importance or
Mm.
urgency or intensity to everything. And then, of course, we're also trained to, at least I am, to have this absolute horror of other people being offended or hurt or disappointed. And, what you're saying really is that there's nothing to do about that, that's their choice. But it's very hard to break that habit because it's assigned goodness.
Mm.
It's maybe a negativity in fact, but it's assigned that title. And your whole upbringing is that it's good to be, really in everybody's life in a controlling way because you're doing it for good. So, it lurks. It's a lurking thing.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole Dharma teaching that I thought about talking about today, which I decided not to. It's called Letting Go of Outcome. And an extreme example of it was, I know somebody who was a building contractor with lots of projects going on, and he would spend his days driving from one to the other, and he would be on the headphones, the cell phone with headphones, ordering materials and oh, the electrician can't make it today, he won't be here till Monday, and dealing with all these difficulties and keeping all these projects going and trying to make absolutely sure that when the carpenter showed up, the lumber was there or whatever. And his life was just total anxiety and very stressful and not very pleasant. And he absorbed and understood the teaching of letting go of outcome. And he switched to being a being who simply, whatever he needed to do right now, he did to the best of his ability. And then he let go of the outcome. Like he would order the lumber and he would say it needs to be there on Tuesday. And then he would let go of it. It's either there or it's not, And he had completely abandoned worry. And he cruised through these incredible days in a state of pretty much complete relaxation. Having cruised through them in a state of total anxiety for years. What one needs to do is just to simply focus on what you're doing and making sure that your act is as good as it can be in terms of wholesomeness and goodness and pure motivation and all that. And then whether it works or not, that's not so much your concern, It's like you could find a starving person on the street and you could give them money for food, and then whether they go buy food with it or not, that's their business. You've given them the money. Of course, you could take them for a meal and ensure that they get food, but really letting go of outcome is extremely important. And then you do your best, and then whatever happens doesn't cause you very much suffering, if any.
that ties back to what you were saying about there is not really any set reality. It's the way of being that we are in this dream. So it's the way we are being. So like when you said it's the act, it's actually not as much the act, it's how we are acting. So that's kind of when it starts to become playful, because like I wake up with my propensity, whatever choices I made as a younger person, to be a particular way, worry or despair or whatever, I carry that. But then I get to see, well, there it is. There is that whole basket of how I am being, and it's so basic that it's not even a choice. It's just an unconscious way of being. But if you get a taste, if I can just remember a simple taste of joy, or a simple taste of something that I prefer, then I can actually start to remember it. Like, oh, I'm actually at the place now where I
Yeah.
I know that I can have a choice, but the old stuff is that's kind of my pattern. But it's none of this actually has anything to do with that, the way of being that we are asked to be attentive to. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I should make up a new dance. I taught Carol a dance a while ago. So you can celebrate. There's no set reality. I have no idea what's going on. I'm stuck in anger and all this stuff, and I don't know what to do. Whoopee!
And Carol loved it. She was like, she loved it. I don't remember what her particular thing was, but it's like, I'm really depressed. I can't stop eating. And what's the?
Oh no, but also she has no way of making a living. She doesn't
Yeah.
know what the future
Yeah.
holds.
Whoopee.
And whoopee. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because otherwise we said it, right? Like we
Yeah.
said it. We said in our propensity to.
That's another way of breaking negative energy, is just to name what it is and celebrate it and say whoopee.
Yeah, but can I ask something?
Sure.
Sometimes you don't double check about the lumber and it doesn't come,
Yeah.
and you get fired. Sometimes you do something that's more important, and
Right,
you
but
don't do
but
your
what
job,
what
and
what I
you
was
get
saying
fired.
was he did the best that he could. If it needed double checking, he double checked it.
Oh,
He
okay.
did the best he could, and beyond that, you
You
can't
just
do
let
better.
go of the worry.
Yeah, and then if they fire you, well, fine, then, you let go of the outcome. But, if you'd rather feel guilty, well, then celebrate the guilt, Whoopee, I screwed up, now I feel terrible,
I
yay!
may be doing that dance after I get home and check my computer.
There is a,
Guilty.
there is a whole teaching and also scientific evidence to support that, if you're in a negativity and you just pretend to be positive, knowing full well that it's fake, and you put a smile on your face
Yeah.
knowing that it's phony, it will turn it around and make it positive. That's another thing one could do. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that the negativities generally come from the skandhas, so let's talk about that a little bit. So what we normally think we are is this body with everything going on in it, and they often divide it into 5. So you have the body. The body has senses of various kinds, so you get you take in sensory data. That's the second one. The third one is that you sort of analyze that. That's called perception. So you touch something and you look at it and so on, and then you put all that together and say, oh, that's a chair or that's a lamp or whatever. That's the third one, is perception. And the fourth one is how you react to that. So you like it, you don't like it, you're indifferent to it, whatever it is. That's called mental formations. And the fifth one is the ongoing, the continuous ongoing of all these processes give you what appears to be consciousness. And we normally identify with all that, and animals have those same things, and they're completely identified with them. So what happens in reality is that the skandhas remember everything that happens to you, and if you got some short-lived pleasure out of something, then they look at that in a favorable light, and if you got some pain out of it, they look at that in a bad light. So one way that it would work is that a small child goes into a medical place and gets a shot, and then a few years later he goes into a medical place for something else. He's not going to get a shot, but the skandhas remember that, and then he pitches a fit and does all kinds of things and struggles and tries to get away and all of that just to avoid the shot that isn't coming, and the skandhas are based in short-term values. One example that I tell sometimes is that I used to have a particular kind of depression, and when I was in meditation and the mind slowed down and I could see a particular thought arise, and then the mind started to cloud with depression, and what had happened was when I had first had this thought, it had made me sad. And the skandhas interpreted that as a negative thing, and they developed this choice of making me depressed for 3 months so as to avoid 5 or 10 minutes of sadness. And that was the first time I ever said completely no to them, and I just chose whatever I wanted, which was not that. So what will happen in reality is that there will be a certain set of circumstances, and the skandhas will, in effect, suggest a response. And if you're totally identified with them, which most of us are, then you will adopt that response instantly as your own. So you're perfectly fine, and you're watching television, and they put a food commercial on, and the skandhas will see that. They will remember sometime you ate it and it was pleasant, and they will suggest wanting it, even though you're not, you don't need any food right now. And if you're totally identified with the skandhas, you will experience that as, oh, I want that. And if you're not totally identified with it, then you can choose. One time I was in New York City in a hotel, and the TV was on, but the sound was off, and it was the news, and they were showing a quarrel between two ethnic groups in a neighborhood in New York City. And when I saw the one ethnic group, hatred started to arise in me. But I knew for sure that I had never seen this ethnic group in this life, and I knew for sure that I didn't hate them. And so I was able to simply watch the skandhas suggest and try to generate hatred toward this group. And I just sat there in a very detached way and watched it, and knew that this was just coming from the skandhas and had nothing to do with me. And then later I had a vision where in a previous life I had appeared to have been a member of that group, and people had been mean to me. And so the skandhas, including my parents, and so the skandhas, as soon as they saw that particular appearance, they somehow remembered this so-called previous experience, and they responded with hatred, which is really fight or flight, like get the heck out of there if you can, but these people are not good for you. And so what one can learn to do is to develop a little bit of freedom from identifying totally with the output of the skandhas. So that something happens, the skandhas suggest anger, you can choose whether to go with that or not. And if you want to go with it, it's very easy, you just let it happen, and if you don't choose that, it just doesn't happen. I was at a board meeting once, and I was sitting there and somebody did something and the skandhas suggested anger. and I just laughed, no thanks. And so no anger arose, It's just that simple.
Do you notice, like, when that happens, that there's kind of like it takes a little bit of, things kind of have to stop, though. You kind of take like a timeout. It's like a personal timeout where you're watching, you're not, like if the conversation at the board meeting is going on and you're involved with, oh, isn't that interesting, I had this thing, but you're doing your own, No,
it all just happened in a few seconds, it didn't interfere with listening. The thing is, you have to be mindful at the moment it arises, and then you can choose whether to go with it or not. I think that's probably the key. So I one time had an experience where for about 6 weeks I more or less separated from the skandhas. So I experienced it as if I was out in space a few feet to the right, and the mind and body kept doing what it was doing. And me, if we call the part that's out there me, I had no thoughts. I had no negative emotions of any kind. I had no desires. I happened to be in Bombay during that time, and I could have gone out to wonderful restaurants. I could have gone to movies. I could have seen live music. I could have gone for beautiful walks along the ocean. And the part of me out there had no desire. The concept of doing something for pleasure simply did not exist. And the mind and body, that was where all the negativities were. That's where all the greed, hatred, pride, ignorance, and all of that stuff was. And so I experienced it for a little while as being totally separate from that, and seeing that really the real me, or the real you, has never in all of eternity been angry. It's only the skandhas that generate it, and then if you identify with it, then you experience it as I am angry. But all of the negativities are they're just not really you. And if you can learn to get a bit of separation between you and the output of the skandhas, then life becomes much more pleasant, because instead of anger coming up and you have no choice but to be angry, well, anger can be suggested and you just don't go with it. Or any of the negativities can arise and you just don't go with it. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, but how did you go back? Did you? I would have
Oh, I
wanted to stay
just
there
gradually,
forever.
I would sometimes just drift into the body, and then I would experience it like life normally, and then I would drift out again, and as time went on, I spent more time in the body and less time out. But at the beginning, I spent almost all the time out, and so I had gone to Bombay with the idea of taking advantage of all these pleasures and so on, and instead I sat in my room on a cot. And once a day I ordered toast and an omelet and tea or something like that. I had no desires of any kind whatsoever, and I was just in a total state of positivity. So even positivity isn't the right word. Just in a totally wonderful state, without it being anything exactly. So these are all things that we can learn. It's not like you necessarily have to solve each and every particular negativity. If you can simply get some separation from the skandhas, it's all solved immediately, which is good news, I would think. And also, we already have some separation from the skandhas. For example, if you're sitting here, the skandhas monitor everything 24 hours a day. So if you get thirsty, they will tell you. And then you have a choice. Do I want to go get a drink now, or do I want to wait until after this is over? We already have some separation. If they tell you you're too hot, you're not compelled to right away do something about it. Or if you're too cold, you can evaluate it for yourself. So you have that freedom. You see that? Mm-hmm. And then during the night when you're sleeping, they will monitor whether you have to go to the bathroom. They will monitor the noises. If an unusual noise happens, they'll wake you up. If it's just normal, they'll let you sleep. And but we already have some separation. So if you watch what happens with bodily functions like hunger, thirst, heat and cold, having to go to the bathroom and so on, you will see how the skandhas operate. And they're not your enemy. Like if you start not going with what their output is, they don't get angry and go pout somewhere, or anything. They're totally okay with it. They're not interested in running anything. They're just there to monitor things, and then based on conditioning, let you know what's going on. And so they're very, very useful. There doesn't have to be any kind of power struggle to stop identifying with them. They're not interested in power.
I guess it's more of a power struggle for the awareness, because they're running things right now. Like, for example, fear, or all those things are like
Again, they're not running things. They're putting out suggestions, and if you choose by habit to be totally identified with it,
yeah, but I'm not.
then it appears as if they're running things.
But I'm not in a place of, and most of our community, I think, or I'm an example of somebody who is in the in habit.
Yeah.
I am not
Right.
able to slow things down and say, oh, I am following my scanners right now. I'm making knee-jerk reaction. I'm not even knee-jerk reaction. This is just the machine. I'm on the treadmill of my habits.
Yeah.
And I can't see them. I might see them, but I can't. You know what I mean? Like.
Right, and so one, and that's how we all are. So one needs to find, one needs to start watching them, and when they make a suggestion about bodily functions and so on, you can see how they suggest something, and then you have the freedom to choose. And then if you're very mindful when a negativity arises, sooner or later you will see that you have the ability to choose. But you have to be mindful right when it makes a suggestion. And in most people, going from suggestion to I am angry is that quick, very, very quick.
Or for me, the suggestion, just the idea of food, and it's like it's immediate, you have to follow that. Or,
Yeah.
it's kind of like an addiction.
Yeah.
So there's not any kind of exit from that, it's total.
But with a habit like irritation, even if you're not at the point where you can actually avoid going to the state of irritation, the awareness that you chose it is you can choke it back or have it go away.
Yeah.
That's not bad. I mean, it's not the whole tamale, but it's
Yeah.
a step in the right direction. That isn't in any way harmful. Suppressing it.
I remember one time I was in an argument with somebody, and we'd had the same argument hundreds of times, and I just all of a sudden decided not to choose my side, and instantly I was totally happy. It can, if you recognize that it was a choice, one can just unchoose. You had a better expression for it. Choose the other way, or I don't know what you said, but you had a good expression for it. One can do that.
Yeah, but it leads to another question, which is, until you can see it coming and not go there, is the repression is not a bad thing, is it?
Well, a better way,
to not act on it, to feel it.
like if you can't not go there, then you should use one of the techniques that we started off with to dissipate it and turn it into something positive. Right. And if you do that regularly, that has the long-term effect of making you less identified and less attached to it, so that it will be easier at some point to just say, I don't choose that. And you won't get completely free until you have enlightenment. That's what enlightenment is it's freedom, where you're not subject to any of these choices that are sort of made whether you like them or not. Along the way, you will start to have less of them that control you, but there will always still be some that control you until complete enlightenment. And then there won't be anything that controls you. You do everything by choice. And you also at that point have the wisdom not to choose suffering. You know, in one sense, enlightenment is going beyond suffering. But in reality, a lot of that is simply not choosing to suffer. Even things like physical pain, Lama from Winnipeg had several surgeries without anesthetic, and he was able to simply not interpret the pain as pain, and therefore not to suffer at all. And most of us are not there. I couldn't do it, you know. I experienced his surgery as pain just hearing about it.
Me too.
You know, the good news is that as we go along, we will start to suffer less and less. One of the things I've found with all my diseases and so on is that I actually don't suffer from them very much. I suffer more from them when I'm around other people and trying to do things. But when I'm by myself and chronic pain arises or any of the other conditions, I usually don't experience it as suffering. It's just there, you know, it's just what is. But sometimes I suffer, you know, I'm definitely far from perfect at it. Another one I was going to talk about, but I'm not going to talk about very much, is cultivating peace and bliss. I'll just talk about it briefly.
Oh no, I want lots of it.
Do you? Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the Buddha said it was very easy for people to see the suffering associated with hatred and anger. You know, like when you're in a state of hatred, you don't feel good. You make other people not feel good, and if anybody acts on anything, then there's lots of harm. And he said, but it's much more difficult for them to see the same thing with regard to, say, desire or pride or envy or whatever. And so the way, on the path of bare attention or the path of mindfulness, the way it works is that through meditation, you cultivate states of peace and or bliss. And if you were to talk to most new Dharma practitioners and you would say, do you want peace? Do you want bliss? They would say, oh yes, I do, you know. But in fact, they don't. You know, the moment they have any peace or bliss, something will arise to take them out of it, and they will go with that, you know. So when you meditate and the mind settles down, then spontaneous periods of peace and bliss arise. And when you're in a state of bliss and peace, it's incredibly pleasant, and all aspects of you, including the skandhas, like it a lot. And then what happens is a negativity will arise, and it will throw you out of peace and bliss back into normal reality, and you will be in suffering. So if desire arises, you will experience it like the 3-year-old in the grocery store that can't get what they want. And you will experience the suffering that desire really is. You know, desire is, the way that desire works is that it's actually a very unpleasant state that we want to get the object of the desire to make the desire go away. But, you know, we go through these cycles of it that we don't even notice most of the time how incredibly unpleasant it is. So, on the path of bare attention, you attain peace and bliss, and then when these states, like desire, arises, you experience them every bit as painful as hatred and anger and all of the other negativities. And then at some point the being comes to really prefer peace and bliss to anything else. And then the attachments to all of the negativities simply fade away. It's that, would you rather be in a transcendent state of peace and bliss, or would you rather be in a horrible state of desire for something that you maybe can't even have, In a sense, that's the ultimate cure for all of the negativities, is to create through meditation or other means a state that is superior to those, and until the depth of your being becomes convinced that it's much better to live in peace and happiness and bliss than to live in the ups and downs of negative arisings. Does that make sense? No? Huh?
Yeah,
Yeah?
after me in a couple of lifetimes, I'll get back to you. That's okay.
I'll give you a week and a half, that's all. Okay, so just a few last things. One is let go of the imaginary future. People who worry that if it goes this way, it will be bad, and if, and they do all this worry, and then when tomorrow comes and it goes one way or another, even if it goes the way they were worried about, it's still different than the way they imagined it. The future, in states of worry and all these things, is always imaginary. It's very important to understand that. The being has a deep-seated, deluded belief that if you get the right combination of what you want and like, and you get rid of the right combination of things you don't want and don't like, that you will have it made. Your ship will come in. The prince and princess will live happily ever after. This is a very deep-seated delusion, and it's all based in an imaginary future. So, I remember when I was young and I really wanted a car, and I got a car. And then I was really excited about it for a while, and then after a while, it's just life again, and it's life with a car as opposed to life without a car, but that didn't create permanent lasting happiness for me. It created repair bills when the engine burnt out and I had to get a new engine. The future that you can think of in your mind is always imaginary. And if you can understand that, you can completely let go of worries. You completely let go of anxiety. When they talk about living in the here and now, what that really means is letting go of the imaginary future. And if you do that, the imaginary past tends to go away too. And then you just are. And reality unfolds. And reality will sometimes unfold with unpleasant things and sometimes with pleasant things, but the amount of suffering involved is way, way less than if you worry about it, and then it unfolds negatively anyhow. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah. But the mantra should be the future is imaginary. Two little last things. One is, at some point in existence, one should take stock of one's ongoing characteristics or qualities or habits that are not the best, and try to find some way, if you haven't been able to get rid of them, try to find some way to make them positive. So I'll give an example. I happen to be very interested in mathematics when I was young, and I was always too mathematical in my approach to things all the time. And there was no way to sort of change myself that I knew. So what I discovered was that if I was doing like a mantra practice, I did some practices where you're supposed to do 100,000, and I did the 100,000 and I kept track. And then I just kept going, but I didn't count. And then I discovered that if I wasn't counting, it didn't seem very important, and then I would often stop earlier than I would when I was counting. So I went back to counting and keeping records and calculating averages and all these things, all these mathematical things, and it actually made me practice more. It helped me to practice more and to be more focused on what I was doing. And all of a person's negative another problem that I had was waking up all the time during the night. So what I did for many years was I used that to make dream yoga work better. Because if you sleep all the way through the night and you wake up and you're going to try to remember all the dreams, it's harder. But if you wake up every few minutes, well, then you can remember all of your dreams, because whatever just happened, it was likely just one dream or two dreams, and you can remember them. And so I tried to make that a positive in terms of dream yoga, which worked. And so one should take into account all of one's qualities that we might not like to have, and then if possible turn them into positives also. Okay, the very last thing is right speech. So in getting along with people, we speak to people, and one of the Eightfold Path that the Buddha taught is right speech. And in my experience, Dharma practitioners tend to ignore that quite a bit, and they will gossip, they will criticize other people who aren't there, and they will talk about unwholesome things and so on. And so the guideline for right speech is three things. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And true means not just based on your perception. Like if you receive word that the ferry sailings are going to be canceled tomorrow, and somebody else needs to know that, and you tell them, that can be considered like a truth. It could always change, but as far as you know, it's true. It might be necessary to tell them if you knew they were planning to go to town, and it would certainly be kind to tell them. But if you saw some perceived negativity in some other person, and then you decided to tell someone else about that, and you think you're telling the truth, it isn't the truth, it's just your perception. And it isn't necessary to tell it, and it isn't kind to tell it. So really it should be all three of those, and if one thinks about that from time to time and just review, what your communication was today. Was everything you said today necessary? Was it true? Was it kind? It's a very good way for shaping up your speech, and one of the benefits of that is getting along with people better. If you're speaking in harsh ways, or speaking in unwholesome ways, or speaking based in negativities, or saying what's not true, and all of these things, it really makes, those are major barriers to really getting along with people. So it turns out that was not the final thing I was going to say. The final thing I was going to say is that if one deals with one of one's own negativities most of the time and deals with them in the ways we've described. One of the things is that one's view of one's own negativity start to change. And you start to no longer want to criticize yourself for having them. You understand that beings come with a package of negativities, and you're trying to work through them, and you become much more accepting of yourself as you are. Not some improved version of yourself that doesn't have all these things, but you start to accept yourself more as you are. And the byproduct of that is that you start to spontaneously accept other people as they are. So, earlier on, one winter, there was only 2 of us here at the Hermitage, and the other person liked to control everything. And I used to, that person would cook, and I would wash the dishes afterward. And that person would stand over me and criticize every move I made and tell me to do it their way. And because it was spontaneously happening, that I was giving her permission to be whoever she was, I experienced that as entertainment. I just thought it was really fun. What's going to happen next, you know? And I just truly enjoyed it. And I had no hard feelings toward that person. I had no expectation that they be different than they are. That's one of the byproducts, and that happens a lot. It doesn't happen all the time. There's some people that I have a hard time with, but most people, I'm totally fine with whatever they are, and that's through recognizing that I'm not any better. You know, I mean, I have my package of negativities, they have theirs. Why should I expect them to be perfect when I'm not? You know, and I don't expect myself to be perfect either. So then the byproduct of that is really that you can just love somebody, not based on qualities. And that's a much nicer form of love than when you love somebody because they're this way and they're not that way and that way. You know, that's a very conditional form of love. And the way I was talking about starts to become more unconditional. That you're just loving them, and it's not because they fit some preconceived ideas that you have about what people should be and what they shouldn't be. And if you do all these things, you'll get stuck with happiness, whether you want it or not. Any last questions or anything? Do you think you can actually do some of those things, like Mingyur Rinpoche's technique and so on? The thing, don't be discouraged if it doesn't work in the beginning. These techniques absolutely for sure will work. You know, it's like if you were going to take up furniture building and you tried to build a wonderful dresser with drawers. The first attempt wouldn't likely be very good, but if you kept at it, eventually you could get so it would be good. And these techniques are like that, you know, that when you do them in the beginning, they might not seem to work, and you might put a lot of effort into it. But that just means stay with it, you know, keep trying. And then when they start to work, you will just see the incredible benefit. It's miserable to be stuck in negativity. It really is miserable. And to find some way out and turn it into positivity, that's really wonderful. Okay, let's dedicate any merit from this and from all sources and times to all beings that each without exception attain the ultimate for themselves.